Hey everybody, welcome back to my series on learning Maya for beginners. Today we're going to take a quick look at UV maps. So this is a very important aspect of texturing, and it can be a little bit more on the technical side of things. So it's generally worth taking a little bit of extra time to try to understand this concept. So I'm going to start today as basic as I can possibly get. Now first, I'm going to pull up some pictures. So I've got a sewing pattern here. I like to kind of describe UVs as a sewing pattern. You're sort of going backwards from the process of sewing. So when you're sewing, you go get fabric at the store, and that fabric, when you lay that out on your floor or on a table, it is 2D is what we're going to call it. It lays basically flat. Then you're going to cut out, these specific shapes and then sew these shapes together so that that flat fabric can then be wrapped around a 3D human in a way that it will fit that 3D form. So what we're doing is we're taking the 3D form and we're unwrapping it so that we basically have the flat patterns that then we can put pictures on, like bricks or anything that you really need to. And it is very necessary to get anything more than kind of the basic shaders to create these UV maps. So I've got an example here. In my opinion, this is maybe not the best way to unwrap UVs. So some of this probably works okay. It just seems like there's a lot of them, a lot of small little pieces, and some of this might get very difficult to kind of texture. So it becomes this process of figuring out how to unwrap things in a way where it's going to be most efficient to texture. Now, some of the bigger pieces that are unwrapping would probably be very easy to texture with a map like this. But sometimes what you're doing is you're taking kind of entire chunks of a character like the body and unwrapping. In this case, we have front and back. Same with the hands. You have front and back of the hands. So you're basically laying out flat these different parts of the body. The face always ends up looking a little bit weird. You're kind of creating a seam along the back of the skull and then unwrapping and pulling that forward. And the main reason to do this is so that you don't get any weird distortion with the main part of the face where we're really going to be looking. And if there is distortion, it might be kind of hidden away in parts where maybe hair is covering it up or behind the ears or something like that. So just another example, kind of unwrapped. You'll see this one. They have kept a seam along the arm and along kind of the pinkies for the front and back of a hand. And this is ultimately why you're unwrapping it. So you're unwrapping things so that then you can paint on top of these UVs so that this will be wrapped back around a character. Now, obviously, this looks a little bit weird, but this is what happens when you have to have a two-dimensional picture wrap around a three-dimensional object. And that's ultimately why this process is so important. So there are a number of ways to do the texturing after you get the maps, but it is important to get the maps first. So I've just created a cube, and I'm going to go over to this UV editing mode. Now you'll see that I now have the map of what this cube is in a flattened sense. So I can go to my face mode and we can kind of find where each of these faces is. And essentially what this is doing, if this is the face here, then this face and this face are essentially this one and this one. And it's like we've taken those, and imagine this is a cardboard box and you've cut out kind of the three sides here, and this is going to be the fold. So you can just unfold this toward the front and flatten that out. And you've probably seen cardboard boxes that do start out flat, like a pizza box, and then you fold those up so that you have an actual box or a cube. So I right now have turned on kind of this filled in shaded view. This is probably what it will start out as if you are opening up your UV editor for the first time. I tend to like this because it will show me the different UV shells is what they're called. And essentially that's going to be the different segments that I'm unwrapping in the example where they had the front of the hand and the back of the hand. Even though it's coming from one object, it's two separate shells. Now what I want to do is start this process over. I want to be in control of unwrapping this completely by myself. So in my UV toolkit, if I go to create and use this planar projection, it's going to create kind of this plane essentially, and from that plane it's projecting my new UV map. So we can see that essentially this top face is all we can see over here, and if I go to any of these side faces, it's just showing a line. And that's because, in fact, I'm going to undo just to show this off. That's because this is not something that is going to change as we model. If I were to extrude this in, okay, you'll see nothing here changed, even though I have more faces. So if I were to look at this face, it's just being represented in a single line because it has not been flattened out. Right now it's still trying to kind of be 3D and going back into space in my UV map, which I cannot let it do. And there's a great tool that lets us see what a texture is kind of going to do. So if I turn on this grid view, you'll see that I get these squares that go over the object. I can see the 0, 0 on this face. But here, we're getting some massive distortion. These are bending all weird. They're stretched right here. That's because it doesn't know how to display these cubes based on how I've laid out these UVs. So imagine each of these cubes is like an exaggerated version of a pixel. We use pixels, you know, tiny little squares, to see an image. And if you were to place that, suppose you got an image of bricks, you know, that's going to be made out of pixels. If you placed that over this object, it would look normal here, normal here, normal here, and then real weird over in this area. So that's why we have to unwrap things. That's ultimately what we're trying to do here. And so when I do this planar projection, the same thing is happening. It's projecting it from this top plane. So I see one very clear face, but I'm not going to see any of these. And these two, you'll see, are going to be really stretched out and awful. So the reason I'm starting with planar is it's just a good way to get a clean UV. So now I want to be in charge of where this is going to cut out so that I can unfold it. To do this, I'm going to use my UV and the UV menu, 3D Cut and Sew UV tool. So by selecting this, it says drag to cut, control drag to sew. I'm going to create cuts where I want this to be unfolded. So you have to imagine that this is once again a cardboard box and I have a razor blade. So I'm going to drag along this edge here and then this edge here. And you'll see now I get these white lines indicating that I've made a cut right here. You have to drag to kind of start out this process, but then if you click, it will just add that to your selection. And if you click too many, I don't want this one, for example, but if I were to select it, you'll see it cut this out completely by changing the colors. I can control click to deselect one of these. So essentially what I've done here, I've cut here, and this is going to be a fold. So this face will now fold upward along this seam. I'm going to say that this face is the one that I don't need any cuts because there's going to be a fold and then a fold and then a fold and then the bottom will fold and then this one will fold out the kind of the widest. So I don't need any cuts here, but if I want this to cut out, once again, need to add cuts here and on the other side here and here. So I'm not adding one here because I want this face to cut out and then fold along this, and then both of those together will fold out along this one. Kind of hard to visualize. And that is sort of what makes creating these UVs a bit of a challenge, is you do have to imagine in a way how these should be unfolded in a way that you're going to best be able to add a picture, image, texture, whatever. So I'm going to press Q to exit this tool and just go to my object mode. You no longer see the cuts, but they're still there. If I went back to the 3D Cut and Sew tool, I'd be able to see them and make edits. But now I want to go to Unfold, and I'm going to unfold. I'm going to actually hold Shift and select this first. Reason for this is I like to check this box that says Layout UVs. What this will do is it will fit them within my square in this larger grid. So if I kind of zoom out, you'll see that I have this huge grid where I can potentially place my different UVs. But really, for the most part, you're going to want to just keep them in this one, especially if you're a beginner. It starts getting more confusing. There are certain softwares that can handle putting them in multiple grids, some that can't. So for a beginner, just keep them in this one, from 0 to 1 here and 0 to 1 here. Keep your UV maps. And this layout will keep it inside that space. So I'm going to hit apply and close. And you'll see that unfolds this for me. So it folded the face up that was there, this face and the opposite face here and here, folded those out, and then unwrapped these. So now I have a UV shell. If I right click on this, you'll see I have UV shell options. I can still select edges, faces, and vertices, and I have UVs. I'm gonna go to UV shell so I can select this whole thing. And you'll see I still have the same controls, like pressing E to rotate that I would, and W to move for anything else. And I'm actually gonna use R to scale this in just a little bit, just to ensure that we are in this one grid space. Now if I turn this on, you'll see I'm getting a pretty good representation of what my pixels are going to be doing. I can see where the U, the 1, the V, and this other one are applying, so I can tell that they're not upside down or something weird. For example, if I had flipped it the other way and got this, then whatever image I placed here, it would have flipped it upside down on my actual object. So you kind of want to watch for things like this. Now I'm going to go to UV just so you can see what those will do. This allows me to select these. They look like vertices, but they are UV points. And if I move these around, you'll see it does not change like a vertex would, what is happening on my actual model. What this is going to change is how the image inside this space is going to apply over my object. So if I were to add this weird little distortion and turn my grid view back on, this is what's going to happen. So my pixels would be normal over here, but then they start stretching and pulling in this weird, unusual way based on what I'm doing. Now, sometimes as you're unfolding these UVs, you'll find examples where maybe it looks something like this. I'm going to shrink this a lot, move this down. So you'll see something like this, where you have really, really large squares in one area and then smaller squares here. Now, because these lines, these edges are curving in now, I'm going to get weird distortion there too. But this also can cause problems. This would mean if I put bricks over this, the bricks might look normal in some of these normal grid areas and then be super zoomed in an area like this. So these are things that you sort of have to watch out for. Now, the next thing I just want to go over before we finish up today is how you can make further cuts or sew things back together in an object like this. So if I'm going to select this edge and I say, well, I really would like this to be separated because I need it to be, textured in a different way, or it's going to be more convenient to texture it if it's separated, like maybe the front of the hand and the back of the hand. So if I select an edge, I can go to this cut and sew option and cut it. Now, because I have this color shaded view on, you'll see I now have two UV shells. So I can move this one over. If I turn this back on, you'll see that it's going to do some interesting things for how these are actually applying. For example, if I moved this one and cut the U off, what this would mean is if I had bricks, once again, the bricks on this edge would not be seamlessly going over into this other face where they used to be able to when these were right next to each other. So if I had them over here, now they're going to more seamlessly transition from one side to the next. But this kind of just shows you what creating separate shells can do. So now, if you did unfold separate shells, maybe you unfolded the front of the hand and the back of the hand, but you realize, oh, it's going to be better if I do add a seam where the pinky line is, then we can, once again, select these edges. I'm going to keep them a little bit apart just so you can see what this will do. Moving them closer together would make this easier. But you'll see it's the same edge, so even though it looks like it's selecting two at the same time, it is the same edge. And then we can just sew these in our cut and sew menu back together. So, like I said, this is going to be a little distorted, so I'd probably want to grab these UVs, move them all over to get that about where it was. But now we're back to one UV shell. So this is sort of the process of creating these UV shells. We will look more at these different map options and how you can cut out different things. But this is a good place to start so you can go very basic with it, unfold a cube and see how you could apply a texture. And we'll talk about how to actually attach the image or the texture to this in a later video. So I will see you soon.